we go. All right. Welcome back, Tribe from the North, Brave and Bold, to the official, unofficial podcast of your Idaho Vandals. I am your host, Chris Hammond, and with me today I have Brian Marceau.
Hey, guys. Good to be back.
And we have a special guest, the all-knowing FCS correspondent for Hero Sports, Sam Herder. Sam, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on your guys' show.
Yeah, I'm trying to make you feel at home for those watching on YouTube. I've got my North Dakota State shirt on today because we're covering the FCS, which includes the reigning national champions. This episode, like all episodes, are brought to you by Montucky Cold Snacks. Ain't nothing like cracking a Montucky Cold Snack, an ultra-refreshing light beer born in majestic Big Sky country. The best part is when you crack a snack, you're giving back. Montucky Cold Snacks donates 8% of all profits back to local causes, even right here in Idaho, supporting organizations like the CW Hogs and the Idaho Food Bank. Yeehaw! That's frickin' awesome. Montucky Cold Snacks, the light American lager for pow pow rippers, gator wranglers, pony riders, and badass do-gooders. Visit MontuckyColdSnacks.com today to find out how to get your ass some snacks. So it's summer. I'm hot. No AC out here in Seattle, so let's just get right into Around the Bar and open up some taps. I'm going to start, for those of you that follow us on Twitter and everything, I just posted Idaho's down 2 games. The Pac-12 has announced that they are going conference only, as well as the Great Northwest Athletic Conference, which is the home to Western Oregon, which is our Week 1 opponent this year. I just published a little blog post today, just kind of going over some fun little alternatives to what we could do, whether that's just leave Week 1 and Week 3 open or try to find some scheduling. Obviously, the reigning national champ, North Dakota State, was impacted by this with the matchup against Oregon and a couple other FCS teams like NAU, or at least Big Sky teams like NAU with Arizona State. And it really leaves everything in a bit of a flux because we still don't know what's going to happen nationally. You could put someone on the books and they're going to go away. But I don't know. I'm curious on your guys' opinion. If you were Terry Gawlik in this situation, Idaho's athletic director, do you try to fill these games? Because on her Cup of Joe conversation, which we'll kind of Brian and I will debrief after we have Sam on, she brought up basically saying no comment on whether they're exploring the option, which makes it seem to me that she has made calls and she just won't speak about who she has called. Obviously, JMU is making a big push out of the CAA, with the CAA saying it's up to individual members. So that's a school that's looking to fill 12 games or 11 games. But I don't know. If you were the AD, would you just wait and see how things go out, focus on what you have, or would you be focusing on trying to get 11 games, assuming we have FCS playoffs? It's going to be important.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the tricky part is you want to make sure you have all your bases covered. And I think if you are the AD, I mean, for any of these schools, you should be looking or at least making phone calls and, getting some contracts and stuff written up, but nothing signed yet, just because, I mean, you don't know if maybe the Big Sky decides to go conference only or regional only. And, that might, if you're Idaho, you don't want to schedule, maybe an area D2 team and say, yeah, we'll play you on this date, but all of a sudden the Big Sky comes out and says, we're only going to play conference only. And then you have to go to that D2 team and say, yeah, sorry, unfortunately, we actually can't play you because of the change of plans here. So that's kind of the dilemma a lot of these schools are facing right now. A lot of FCS schools right now are facing is just, what do we do? How do we attack this? Do we want to fill our schedule? How hard do we want to look for games? I know James Madison and North Dakota State, they're being pretty aggressive and trying to try to play a full 11 games. It's just a matter of, how far do you want to take that? Do you actually want to sign game contracts or not? That's the tough dilemma to decide if you're these FCS teams.
Yeah, I floated around in my article, both North Dakota State, thanks to Oregon, and North Dakota State in Week 3, thanks to NCA&T, a little home and home with Idaho. That's an option. I don't recommend it for us in terms of trying to make a playoff push, but I think it's going to be something creative like that at Idaho. It's something we're used to with when we had to play New Mexico State twice in a year. But Brian, what are your thoughts on all this?
Idaho's in a weird position where due to the cancellation, we don't have a home game until I believe is it the first or second week in October. It's not till October 10th that we're
October
scheduled
10th against Portland State for homecoming with the week 1 gone. Yep.
Yeah, which gives us, in terms of scheduling, something which I don't know if a lot of fans will support me here. I hope we look to schedule a couple away games because if we're going to have football in the fall, it's great for us to have that month of padding for things to, fingers crossed, get better, or if things don't get better, to have time to adjust what the protocols are. It was announced, Terry Gawlik announced, and it was covered by a handful of newspapers that, we're going to have limited 5,100 fans for the games, mask requirements, stuff like that. And, our university's already put in, we've actually been a regional leader in saying what football will look like provided we can play here. And I think, having that month right now, as much as I'd rather have a 5 home game schedule, that month off just for insurance, I think is great for us. And I think from the financial standpoint, man, we got to look at, I want a couple games. If we're going to play in the fall, I want as much of a full season we can get. But I think with some of the money we're losing, if we got to look at scheduling a couple of away games.
Yeah. The impact of college cancelations is obvious because who knows if people are even going to be paying for away games. So is it worth trying to do something like I kind of joked about, doing a home and home with another FCS team? That way you're not paying someone to come to you and you're not going to get money to go somewhere else. But it seems like at least out west, you're not going to have those options like the Pac-12, possibly the Big 12 and the Big 10. So it's something to look at. Brian, pick a tap.
All right. So this is kind of two at once, which I think some of our listeners will know about this, but not all of our listeners will. We have 5 FCS conference have announced that they are postponing their football season. That's the Ivy League, Patriot League, the SWAC, and the MEAC. The CAA is canceled, but it says its teams can schedule independently. JMU and Elon have both said they're going to attempt to schedule independently. JMU has also said if there's no championship that the season could build to, they might not be interested in the independent schedule. Simultaneously, we had the Power 5 announcement that has wiped, our game against Washington State away. Both of those, the FCS conferences canceling, particularly those who have auto bids to the playoffs, is pretty impactful for what might happen in the future. But Power 5 games are a big deal too in terms of the money from those programs. Sam, I'm curious from your end, what do you think is a bigger deal for? Let's talk about the top 3 FCS conferences: Missouri Valley, Big Sky, CAA. CAA is obviously a big one, but what do you think is more impactful? FCS conferences with playoff auto bids canceling, or the guarantee games from some of the Power 5 schools going away?
Yeah, so I think right now the as far as when you're comparing to the Power 5 conferences that have canceled non-conference and to these specific FCS conferences that have canceled their seasons, I think the Power 5 right now has played a bigger influence on things. Now, obviously, the CAA canceling their season or postponing their season, if you want to get technical, that was a huge domino to fall for the FCS. But I know, in talking with some FCS conference officials, for the most part, the Ivy League does their own thing. Without, they already do play less games than normal. They start their season later in a normal year. They obviously don't play in the playoffs. So the Ivy League is kind of in their own world when it comes to the FCS. The Patriot League operates a little bit like the Ivy League. So those two, I wasn't really surprised when they postponed their seasons. The same thing with the MEAC and the SWAC. They kind of do their own thing with the Celebration Bowl as well. So, when those 4 conferences canceled, I don't know if it played a huge impact on the Big Sky and the Valley, but I do know, the Southland and the SoCon, the Valley, the Big Sky, the bigger conferences that are still playing, they're kind of following the lead of the FBS, and they're kind of seeing what the FBS is doing and following that lead. So I think when the Big Ten announced that they're doing conference only, I think that kind of perked up the ears to the Valley. That's also in the Midwest, obviously, to say, all right, they're going regional only. This might be something that we're going to have to do. So, I think that the Power 5 canceling non-conference has been really impactful compared to like the Ivy League postponing their season. I don't think that really influences what the Big Sky or the Valley will do. Now, the CAA, on the other hand, that was a big domino to fall.
Yeah, the CAA to me was very surprising, just because they are so big, and in terms of regional, even if one or two of their institutes, they're like the Big Sky in terms of like, even without a couple institutes, they could play a rather healthy conference schedule. And they're in an area that's got a lot of close proximity teams. So if you do, let's say the ACC did pull out, you have, Conference USA, the Sun Belt, and teams kind of somewhere in that footprint, the AAC that you could pull from to schedule, including in the FCS. So I do agree with you that the CAA making that decision and making it so soon seemed to be a really big kind of domino. And it's just really thrown this whole conversation. Because when we first asked you to come on, right, we had a full top 25. We were going to break down who to look for. Now we're probably going to touch on the top 25 here shortly, and it's half the teams are missing. So it's if football does happen in the fall, which I'm optimistic about, but that could just be me being a glass half full approach. It's going to be weird anyways, because there's so many teams. Like if JMU can schedule, that's great, but you're still going to miss teams like Delaware, like Towson. Like you have these teams that have been nationally relevant that don't seem to be partaking this year, and it's going to be interesting. With that, I kind of wanted to start touching on the top 25. I mean, you guys, Hero Sports, take pride in kind of being one of the first polls out. And you guys talk about how it's kind of a predictive. I mean, all polls are kind of a little bit of predictive with also taking effect scheduling. Because I know how you brought up your guys came out before the Thompson news, transferring from Sac State. But you also mentioned how Sac State doesn't change that much in your mind because they have such an easy Big Sky schedule. But now looking at this, like NCAA is out. That's a top 20 team for most people, including you guys. Who do you kind of see? I mean, if you had to say some teams to kind of fill out the bottom half of the top 25 that might not have made your top 25 before, are there any teams you particularly think might make it?
Yeah, so there's a couple that that I would slide up into our top 25. And how Brian and I did it is we both did our own personal top 30s, I believe, and we gave each slot a point total. Then we combine the points and then form the top 25 from there. So I mean, like I had, we got a lot of grief for not having Nichols in our top 25. I actually had Nichols number 14 in my poll, but I think Brian had them outside his top 25 somewhere. So point total wise, they dropped out of our top 25. I also had Wofford at my number 20 spots. And they ultimately, I don't believe they made our top 25 either. So those are two teams that I would probably slide in, are Nichols and Wofford, because, I mean, you have to, like you said, there's some teams you have to take out just because they have canceled or postponed their season. I know we had a couple of Ivy League teams in there as well that you would bump out. So, yeah, that is another interesting part of this season, if there is games in the fall, is there going to be a normal top 25 poll during the fall and then do like another top 25 during the spring for those set of teams? I would imagine that's what would happen if we did have a fall and a spring season.
I know Craig Haley's already joked about that, and he has this like spring 2021 top 5.
Yeah, I saw that. We can already start looking forward to the spring and have a way too early spring, top 5 of teams we know for sure are playing in the spring.
So before we dive kind of into the tiers and who's really going to be a championship contender, from the top 25, I want to kind of go back to world's functioning as normal kind of question for you. How annoyed do you get and your general stance? I mean, obviously, we all listen to the BMAC and Herd Sports podcast. But and you guys talk about it. For some of our listeners who might not, like, the FCS has the Ivy Leagues who do not participate in the playoffs, but consistently have 2, possibly even 3 teams that are really good, top 25 quality, sometimes one that might even be top 10. And then you have your HBCUs that also participate in the Celebration Bowl. So some people always argue that they shouldn't be ranked in top 25 polls. I know my personal stance on that has always been, wouldn't you prefer that if you're playing them, they count as an FCS win, you'd like to know where they rank within the FCS, because the top 25 has no bearing on the playoffs. Just because we see it all the time with like Eastern, 3 years ago, even if you're in the top 25 doesn't mean you're going to make the playoffs. So I've never understood the anti-Ivy and HBCU in top 25 people, but I guess explain to people kind of what I might have missed and kind of your guys' thoughts on when people are super against it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're an FCS team, you should be voted for, in the top 25. I think it's that plain and simple. It's not the top 25 playoff poll. It's the FCS top 25. And I know, some have some weird grudge against the Ivy Leagues for not playing in the playoffs, and they think because of that they don't deserve to be ranked in the top 25. But I mean, if you look at the recruiting class rankings, I mean, Harvard and Princeton and Dartmouth, they're routinely bringing in, top 3, sometimes even number 1 recruiting classes in the FCS. You can look at the number of guys they send to the NFL. And you can kind of look at that and say, all right, it's pretty high quality football. And so they deserve to be ranked in the top 25. Where they land between 8 and 16 or 16 and 25, that's really hard to judge, just because the Ivy League doesn't really play anyone in their non-conference. They'll play like the Patriot League, which isn't, a great measuring stick. I mean, it would be great for Princeton to play James Madison, or, Harvard to play North Dakota State, just to have a measuring stick. Games we can really see how, truly see how good they are. But that is kind of the interesting part about the FCS, is it's so widespread. And, my focus usually is, how do things impact the playoff picture? That's kind of my national look on things, is, anything that's happening on a Saturday, what I'm paying attention to is stuff that's going to impact the playoff picture. But at the same time, the Ivy League, does deserve some recognition. The HBCUs, they deserve some recognition as well. And I think they fly under the radar too for casual FCS fans, because they send a bunch of people, a bunch of players to the NFL, and they have, routinely have some of the highest attended games in the FCS. And so we want to make sure we're paying attention to those 3 leagues as well. And, they're a part of the FCS, so they should be in the top 25 if we think they're good enough to be.
So what would it take for you to ever put like a Ivy or HBCU at number 1? Like, would it have to be like they scheduled James Madison and North Dakota State and won? Because I know, I mean, to put in an instance for the HBCU, how close was NCAA&T? Was it 2018 where they actually beat Jacksonville State in week 0 and actually were looking really good all the way up until about midseason when they got tripped up? Like, has any team ever been close? And I mean, what would it ever take for like Princeton to be ranked number 1, or is it even possible with them not actually being national championship, qualifiers?
Yeah, I don't think you would ever see, an HBCU team or an Ivy League team rise all the way up to number 1 unless they did beat a North Dakota State or a James Madison. Now, like, I mean, if North Carolina A&T, assuming, let's just imagine things were normal this fall and North Carolina A&T beat North Dakota State in the Fargo Dome, I mean, you would have to, and they beat them handily, you would probably raise them to being number 1 in the polls. But, I remember that 2018 year when North Carolina A&T, they did beat Jacksonville State, and then I think they beat like East Carolina for an FBS team. And, someone had an article out that said, is North Carolina A&T actually the best team in the FCS? And I thought that was a bit of a stretch, just because East Carolina wasn't very good. Jacksonville State ended up not making the playoffs that year. They didn't make it very far in the playoffs that year. So yeah, it would take a beating an actual team that's ranked in the top 5 or maybe even number 1 for one of those teams to move up that high.
Okay. Brian, break down these tiers in the top 25 for us.
So from a numeric standpoint, it's pretty simple. I think, but from like a performance standpoint, so Sam, I'm curious how you guys feel about this. I tend to not obsess over like who is ranked number 1 through 5 and just accept if you're top 5, you're probably pretty good. And same with, let's say, 17 through 25. It means you're projected to be all right, but there's question marks. And while some teams maybe should be 16 instead of 18, to me, it mostly just means I mostly understand this as elite, real good, pretty good. So starting with our bottom tier of the top 25, Sam, so let's say 17 or 18 through 25, are there any teams in particular? I'm just going to read also the Hero Sports top 25 that's still available. 17 Eastern Washington, below them Florida A&M, Citadel, Southern Illinois, Sam Houston, possibly Albany, and then you had said Nichols in our earlier discussion. In that, Nichols and Wofford. Thank you. Of those handful of teams, Sam, which team would you be least surprised to see, let's say, finish top 5 or top 10 at the end of the season?
I would probably go with either Eastern Washington or Sam Houston State. I feel like probably more so I would lean Eastern Washington just because when they do have a down year during the 2010s, they always seem to bounce back and make a run to the semifinals or make a run to the national title game. So I would probably go with Eastern Washington for that one. Also keep your eye on Sam Houston State. They may have fallen off the radar a little bit just because they haven't, been that great in recent years. But a lot of people, when they think of Sam Houston State, they think of a team that's putting up 50 points a game and allowing 40 points a game. Really, really good offense, not a very good defense. Last year was actually the opposite. Their defense was really, really good, and it was their offense, that struggled. And I think if they can get their offense going like it was earlier in the 2010s, they would have pretty good team balance. So out of that group, I would say Eastern Washington and Sam Houston State is the most likely teams out of that group to rise up.
So we'll cover Eastern a lot in 2 weeks when we do our Big Sky, but just because I've got you on, I kind of want to ask it. They've been like a really big team I've like been sleeping on. I'm starting to get more behind to the point where I almost thought picking them for the Big Sky, just because. And I guess to talk me off this ledge, especially because like some fans that listen to this are going to be upset that I'm so high on Eastern Washington, but last year they were considered a unanimous pick. Basically, I mean, some people had UC Davis. I was one of them to win the Big Sky. And I know you guys were one of the polls that actually had them lower in the preseason, where a lot of people had them like returning as like a top 5 team. And I don't remember where you guys had them like maybe like 8 or something, but it was still a good ranking. And I think you're taking that team that for the most part is returning, probably Walter Payton runner-up. I mean, Trey Lance most likely will probably win it, but in Eric Berrier, you have a lot of players coming back. Most of that defense is going to be healthy this year. Do you almost feel – I mean, you kind of brought it up, obviously, by picking them, but I feel like they're almost being, like, really slept on this year in terms of – I feel like they're returning a lot more. This team is basically what last year's team was supposed to be if it can stay healthy. And I think that people are forgetting that.
Yeah, a lot of voters fall into the habit of looking how last year finished and kind of letting that decide – where they're going to put teams in preseason rankings. Like you mentioned earlier on the show, we try to be a little bit predictive, and we look at what teams have coming back. Like we got a ton of hell last year for not even having Colgate in our top 25 poll, preseason top 25 poll, and people were saying this team made the quarterfinals last year. I mean, how do you not have them in your top 25? And we say, well, look what they have coming back. It's not a lot. I mean, we're not going off of last year. We're going off of what we had this year. And I think Colgate ended up starting the season like 0-7 or something like that. And so I think people do fall into that habit of just kind of refurbishing what happened last year. So I do think Eastern Washington has probably slipped in a lot of people's polls. I don't think I would put them up there too high. I don't think I would in the national polls and the Big Sky rankings. I don't have their schedule in front of me, but I know all of their toughest games are at home this year. I think they play like 3 of the 4 teams that made the playoffs last year, and all those games are at home. So somewhat favorable in a way, but I still like, Weber State is that favorites in the Big Sky, and I still had Montana and Montana State ahead of Eastern Washington. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if Sacramento State ends up, placing 3rd or 4th in the Big Sky Conference standings, just because you look at I can't remember what the number is, but you look at the teams they're playing, they all had a combined record of like 16-36 last year in the Big Sky. So, I mean, Sac State has a really, really favorable schedule. Even without Kevin Thompson, I think they could finish pretty high. So I think you're looking at Eastern Washington kind of in that 4 to 5 range in the Big Sky. And with that, I think, they're nationally, they're probably in that 15 to 20 range for the preseason.
If we look at the second tier, now I'm going to start at 7, read off what you guys have. Montana's number 7, Villanova number 8, Montana State 9, Central Arkansas 10, Kennesaw State 11, Illinois State 12, Austin P 13, followed by Furman, Delaware, then New Hampshire. Now, first, the question everyone has wanted to know forever. In the battle of, let's say, interesting turfs, Central Arkansas versus Eastern Washington, who wins in your mind, Sam?
Probably.
We're talking turf only.
Yeah.
Talking turf only.
I would probably say Central Arkansas. I think people are aware of Eastern Washington's pure red turf by now, but I think when they see the striped,
the two-toned
purplish, I think that still is a shock on the eyes when you see it on TV.
That's a strong pick. The pajama look is interesting, although for listeners, you can buy part of the old Eastern Washington red turf if you act now, or at least before July 31st. I bought a $20 doormat because it's symbolic of how some people think about Eastern. But jumping back into the tier, Sam, I guess the question that I think, and I'm going to let you skip Montana State just for a second, because I want to talk about a few teams our listeners might not be as aware of. Kennesaw State has been pretty dang good for relative to how young that program is. They've essentially been nothing but good, but they're also in a little bit of a weaker conference. A team like Illinois State is in a real tough conference, Missouri Valley, which can be, blessing in disguise, and that you play some good teams, but that also means you play some good teams. Of the teams in that second tier, we went over same premise. Do you have a team or two who you would not be shocked to see, if the stars align, they finish top 5?
I think out of this group, I'm probably Kennesaw State. They don't play a strong schedule. Once again, I think they play two. I guess I know originally they were playing 2 non-counters. I don't know if any of those. One might be NAI, one might be D3. I don't know where those teams stand as far as, they may have canceled their season as well. So I don't know what Kennesaw State's schedule looks like exactly as far as those teams. But I know originally they had 2 non-counters. They also had an FBS opponent, Kent State, and that's a winnable game. And then I think they'll run through the Big South like they usually do, minus last year when Monmouth got them. But Monmouth has a ton of seniors gone from last year. So I think, if Kennesaw State is able to play that FBS game and get a win there, I think we're looking at an undefeated Kennesaw State team. And, as they keep on winning games, and let's say, South Dakota State loses a game, even in my opinion, I would still probably keep South Dakota State ahead of Kennesaw State because I think South Dakota State is better. The more teams in the top 5 that lose and Kennesaw State keeps on winning, then they kind of move to the other side into the top 5. So that's just kind of how polls go. People slide teams in and out. So I think Kennesaw State is the team out of that group that it wouldn't surprise me if they move into the top 5 and even get a good playoff seed if they do get that FBS win.
And another team that's impacted in that second tier, Austin P longer has their head coach. I believe his name is Mark Hudspeth. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So do you see them as a team that could I don't know. Maybe they have now entered the coin flip world of new coach, unstable year to begin with. I would say, they look like on paper a team that they've got to have some things definitely go right to stay in that mid tier. What do you think about Austin Peay?
Yeah, I like what they have coming back. I think they'll be the best team in the OVC. They do lose some key players on that team, but I think they are experienced overall, and I think the way they're trending is really positive. But you just don't know how a team will react to losing their head coach like that. No matter it's not quite the same, but you look at what happened to James Madison a couple of years ago when Mike Houston was on his way out. The players said, it's not going to be a distraction, but you could tell on the field that it was a distraction when they lost to Colgate. So we'll see, how Austin Peay reacts to this. He did leave pretty abruptly. We later found out via reports that Coach Hudspeth, he was in the middle of serving a suspension. We aren't sure what exactly he did that led to that suspension, but he was mid-suspension when he decided to resign as head coach. So, the team does have a little bit of time, to adjust. But he's a hell of a football coach, and you can tell that Austin Peay was trending in the right direction in the 2010s. They were awful in the early to mid 2010s. They had like a 30 to 40 game losing streak at one point. And then their old head coach got an FBS job. And you could tell when Hudspeth came in last year, he kind of put that finishing touch on that team and gave them that edge that led them to making a historic run to the quarterfinals. Without him there now, honestly, I probably wouldn't drop Austin Peay in our poll a whole lot, just because at the end of the day, the talent is still there. The talent isn't leaving, but it does kind of make you wonder, what kind of impact this will have once the season hits.
I'm kind of curious we touched on their turf, but Central Arkansas, the team, I feel like this is like kind of 2 years where it's kind of been brewing that they've started to kind of really become more of a competitor. Do you think they have the stuff this year, or is it still just kind of I look at them and Illinois State kind of in the same light, where they both have been kind of deadly teams, but I've never viewed them as really a threat to move maybe even to the semis. Like a surprise, like how maybe Eastern Washington did in 2018. But I just look at this and it's like Kennesaw, I could see maybe sneaking up on people. They've been building for 5-6 years now, where it just seems like they're only getting better and better. But I look at like Central Arkansas and Illinois State, and they feel like two teams that are kind of been flirting with that 10 range. Do they finish around 10, or do you think they finally take a jump forward and maybe become like a Sac State or a Weber State, where all of a sudden they're players?
Yeah, I don't know if either team will, truly threaten for a national title. Central Arkansas, they have a ton coming back. Their quarterback, Braylon Smith, is really, really good. He has something. They basically have their entire running back backfield back. His top weapons are back. The defense is pretty intact as well. So they're basically their entire team is coming back from last year, and last year's team, I believe, was the number 8 seed in the playoffs, but ended up losing right away in the second round. I think they actually ended up losing to Illinois State because they couldn't stop James Robinson. But I think this team will be 1 year better, 1 year more mature. I think they could build off of last year and potentially make a run to the quarterfinals. But I don't know if they take that next step and make it to the semifinals. Illinois State's made it to the quarterfinals last year. Really gave NDSU a big time scare and was one, long, broken tackle touchdown away from beating NDSU in the quarterfinals. Their defense is going to be really, really, really good. Their quarterback, their quarterback last year, Brady Davis, he ended up missing the last half of the year with the torn ACL, but he'll be back. He has all his wide receivers back. The offensive line is really, really good, but replacing James Robinson, who was their workhorse, that's going to be some tough shoes to fill. So I think Illinois State could possibly make it back to the quarterfinals, but they're going to be in a tough spot because I don't think they'll be a seed in the playoffs, just because they have to go through North Dakota State and South Dakota State and Northern Iowa and all those tough teams in that conference. But
very true.
I think they're I don't think either of those teams are national title threats, but I think they're in that tier 2 as far as teams that could threaten a run to the quarterfinals and be in that final 8.
And then looking at your top tier, we have number 1, North Dakota State, number 2, South Dakota State, number 3, Northern Iowa, number 4 had been Sac State. That was pre-Kevin Thompson. 5, James Madison. 6, Weber State. 7, Montana. And also, just for listeners, Montana State's number 9, so right around there too. So looking through those, let's say top 6 right now, Sam. Now, first, I don't want to sell North Dakota State short because of how good they've been. It's just I think they're a no-brainer, number 1 at this point. I'm sure you can add to why they're a no-brainer. But first, I just got to ask a question. This is on behalf of a lot of people in our region. Northern Iowa seems to be top 5 or top 3 like every single year, and then they're not bad, but they're – I don't know. It seems like there is a pattern of they are overrated but good. So it's not like they're a bad program. Like, of course, at Idaho, we'd love to be as overrated as Northern Iowa right now. But we got a lot of people, especially in the Big Sky, who are pretty dang touchy about Northern Iowa being a top 5-ish team. Can you sell me on Northern Iowa top 3?
Yeah, so here's the interesting thing. There seems to be that narrative that Northern Iowa is always way overranked in the preseason. But the last time they were preseason ranked in the top 10 was 2016. Actually, they weren't even ranked in our top 25 last year. And in previous years, they were always kind of in that 15 to 25 range. But I think people just, I don't know, for some, like I even had to go back and look because I even was thinking too, like, yeah, it does seem like Northern Iowa is preseason ranked pretty high quite a bit. But then I went back and looked at the last 5 preseason top 25 polls, and the Panthers weren't really ever really highly ranked. The last time they were, besides this year, obviously, was in 2016. The year prior, they made a run to the quarterfinals. Yeah, I guess to hype up this year's team, I think the top 5 ranking is warranted. You just look at the fact that they did make the quarterfinals last year. They gave James Madison a scare, and basically they leaned on their defense last year, and basically that entire defense is coming back. I mean, they have all conference players and all American players on every single level of that defense, and I think NDSU and JMU fans will hate it, and Weber State fans will hate it, but I think Northern Iowa will have the best defense in the FCS this year. The big question mark is offensively. They had a pretty young quarterback last year, Will McElvain. He was just a redshirt freshman, but I think he'll be able to take a step forward. The offensive line is always big and physical. Isaiah Weston is their big wideout. He's an All-American. Running backs need to get a little more explosive. So the big question mark is offensively, but I do think they deserve to be in that top 5 range just with the talent that they have coming back. I think this could be the best team they've had during the 2010s.
Wow, that's a raving statement, actually. Yeah, I agree with kind of what Brian, you said. I always feel like Northern Iowa is one of those teams, like how I brought up Illinois State earlier, that always seems to be ranked really high, but then you don't really hear from them in deep playoff runs. But I mean, maybe some of that is because they do make deeper playoff runs and end the season ranked, and we're kind of like where'd they come out of. And once again, taking in your feelings from how the season ended into how a season began, some of that, because that is curious. Because I do feel like I always see Northern Iowa, and it's curious to see, like Sam, what you said, that they weren't even ranked in your guys' top 25 last year.
Yeah, and I think what people, when they think of that part about Northern Iowa always being too highly ranked, I think they automatically just think of, they're too highly ranked in the preseason. But what I think it is basically every single year Northern Iowa is 2-2 at the end of September, because they always play like a Montana or a Weber State in the non-conference, and then they play like Iowa or Iowa State. And so they have 2 really tough opponents. They're always 2-2 at the end of September, but you'll see them like hanging around number 15 in the polls at the end of September. And that's when people are like, why is Northern Iowa 2-2 and at number 16 and they're ahead of, a team that's 4-0. And so I think that's kind of where when people see Northern Iowa in polls, I think that might be what they're actually thinking of Northern Iowa being too high. But yeah, they always get put into playoff mode, like in October, where they need to win out to make the playoffs. They ended up, they usually do make the playoffs, and they do end up, getting a first round win, but they always seem to get matched up in the second rounds with a seeded team like South Dakota State and end up losing to South Dakota State, so they don't make a very far run. Last year, they actually beat South Dakota State in the second round when South Dakota State was seeded and made that run to the quarterfinals. But they haven't done a ton of damage in the playoffs in recent years. But last year, they kind of got past that hump, and they have a ton coming back from last year. So that's why I feel pretty highly about them.
So I see, obviously, they're 1, 2, and 3 are Missouri Valley, Northern Iowa being 3, South Dakota State being 2, and North Dakota State being 1. Are those your three or four quarterfinal teams? And are we, based on your guys' poll, going to get a Dakota Marker championship in Frisco? Or do you just think, is this more where you're saying the best teams are ranked 1, 2, 3, not necessarily the teams that are going to make the quarterfinals? Because I feel like it's hard to have 3 teams from one conference make it. But I mean, if they all get in, then the destiny's kind of in their own hands as long as they don't get seeded against each other.
Yeah, the chances of actually having 3 Valley teams in the semifinals would probably be pretty tough. The bracket would have to make that possible, obviously. But, I do think entering the season, these are the 3 best teams in the FCS. Yeah, I really, really like South Dakota State. Their defense really took a step up last year, and they have 9 of their 11 starters coming back on that side of the ball. Offensively, when healthy, they really showed what they could do. I mean, they nearly knocked off Minnesota, and I was at that game. The season opener very nearly knocked off Minnesota, and that was the Gophers' best team that they've had in quite some time. When they were fully healthy against North Dakota State, really took it to the Bison in the first quarter. And then their starting quarterback, Jabari Gibbs, got hurt. He ended up missing the rest of the year. Their standout running back, Pierce Strong Jr., he got hurt late in the year. And so they really limped into the playoffs, especially offensively. But I think if they can stay fully healthy, they, to me, appear to be the most balanced team in the FCS behind North Dakota State. And that's why we have them number 2.
How big is the gap?
I think it's pretty big this year.
With North Dakota State and everybody else, or do you think those 3 actually have a shot?
No, I think there's a gap between NDSU and everyone else this year, and then I think you can kind of lump those next 6 or 7 teams into tier 2. But I think there's a big gap between the top 8 to 9 teams. I'll just say I think there's a big gap between teams 1 through 10 and teams 11 through 25. I think teams 11 through 25 are all pretty interchangeable. I do feel, the big 3 conferences, they're, if you look at our top 10, it is pretty heavy with the big 3 conferences. I do think there still is that gap there. And I know fans from the SoCon and the Southland and the OVC hate that and think there's some big 3, national bias. But I mean, every year at this time, we get into an argument of, whether the big 3 are actually the big 3 or not. And then every year we get to the playoffs, and it's, 7 out of the 8 teams are from the big 3. And so like every year, the proof is right there in the playoffs. But yeah, I do think, last year I felt North Dakota State and James Madison were 1A and 1B in the preseason. This year, even though we have South Dakota State number 2, I don't think they're the 1B to NDSU's 1A. NDSU just has so much coming back where I think there is a gap between them and everyone else.
So which gap is bigger? The gap between number 1 and number 2, or the other kind of tiered gap you referenced was top 10 versus the rest of the top 25? Which is, in your mind, a bigger gap, 1 to 2 or the 11 to 25?
I would say the gap is bigger between 10, the top 10 and everyone else. I do think there are a lot of teams out there that can compete and push NDSU. I mean, you look at the teams right out of the Valley, South Dakota State, Northern Iowa, Illinois State, they're all going to match up really well with with NDSU in the playoffs. And like I mentioned, I mean, Illinois State, they had basically no threat to NDSU offensively in the quarterfinal game, but their defense played so well and they were able to match NDSU's physicality that, you know, it was a 3-point ball game for most of that game. So I think those three Valley teams can push NDSU in the playoffs. You know, the Big Sky, I think Weber States would be able to match up decently with NDSU. I really think Montana matches up pretty well with NDSU just because of the style of offense they run. I think Montana State's going to be good, but I don't think they match up really well with NDSU. I mean, we saw that in the semifinals. You know, James Madison, you know, they have a lot of talents, young talent, but that's pretty unproven talent. So it's kind of hard to figure out where James Madison is going to be, but, you know, they could potentially mature. And by the time the playoffs hits, you know, assuming we do get playoffs in the fall, you know, they could potentially push NDSU. So, you know, I don't necessarily think this is going to be a season like 2013 when NDSU was beating every single playoff team 35-7. I do think they will get challenged. But I just think, you know, compared to past years, they're the clear cut favorite, not only because of what they have coming back, but what some of these other teams lose.
So I'm kind of curious. There's a lot of teams in the FCS. We've covered basically the top 25, and we've covered how there's a lot of changes in the top 25 compared to when it was published. I'm kind of curious, are there any teams out there that you are saying is totally under the radar? Honestly, we've talked about them already a bit, but like your Sac States, who's a team or UC Davis in 2018? That's a team that's just going to really kind of come out of nowhere, possibly get a seed, maybe not, just be probably, you know, what would be like a 9 or like a big just at large or surprise conference winner.
Yeah, truthfully, I don't know if there is that team this year. If I had to pick one, I know they were kind of this was Matt Frazee. This was his dark horse team last year, but Furman was hot for a little bit at the beginning of last year. They competed really well with I think they had 2 7-point losses to FBS opponents, and that kind of opened everyone's eyes. And then I think they may have started SoCon play like 2-0 or 3-0, and everyone was kind of looking at that Furman as a possible seed. Once October hit for them, though, and mid-October hits, they kind of were up and down. They were a pretty young team last year. And so obviously with being a young team last year, they have a ton coming back this year. I think they can get 1 year better, 1 year more mature. So that's possibly one team that could rise up and earn a playoff seed. But, kind of like I said, it does appear like, the big three conferences are really where the power teams are at. And, I know the CAA has postponed their season, but, James Madison is as long as there's a playoff, they're looking to play. Villanova has left the door open to play. They're another top 10 team. Elon is the third CAA team that said, we possibly might still play this fall. They're 30 to 35-ish range as far as a ranking. But overall, I think, if we do have a playoff this fall, you're going to see all the seeds are coming from the Power 3 conferences in the FCS. Potentially Kennesaw State could sneak into a seed as well, just because of their really good playoff, or just because of their really good overall record.
All right, well, Chris, do you have any other top 25 questions you want to go through before we pull maybe a last tap?
I am good with the last tap if you are. All
right. This relates to something we talked about earlier, which is JMU, James Madison, and also Leon Costello, athletic director of Montana State, has said essentially the same thing, that if there's not a playoff, they are not as interested in a fall season. But at this point, they're certainly JMU is looking to make an independent schedule. Montana State has said it's open to an independent schedule. The maybe dean of FCS, kind of football reporting, of course, outside of people like Sam Herder and Brian McLaughlin, Craig Haley, wrote an article saying he thinks fans should more or less be okay with there not being a playoff potentially not being a playoff this season, which, you know, on paper, that is a relatively reasonable stance of like, hey guys, just be happy we have football. But we also have athletic directors saying, well, look, we're not going to go wild with a really difficult independent schedule if there's no playoffs. So yes, Sam, what's your take on, let's say we get this world that Craig Haley talked about with no playoffs. I mean, do you think that's like kind of a foundation shaking thing for some of these FCS teams? Because I mean, a lot of teams and fans like us take pride in the fact that we have a playoff.
We moved to the FCS for it.
Yeah. I mean, when I think Craig, I think he came out that story last week or 2 weeks ago. And at the time I agreed with him because, and I think I even maybe quote tweeted that or something else where I said, you know, I'm not even thinking about the playoffs right now. I would just be happy if we have games this fall, you know, just because I don't know how likely we are to have FCS playoffs this year, just because at that time I thought the FCS could start on time, but the worry would be, you know, is football going to be able to finish, especially, you know, come November and it's flu season, and, you know, that then things could get a little messy there. But, you know, I've kind of backed off on that a little bit, my stance on the playoffs, just because now I'm seeing how much ADs are shaping their opinion based off of the playoffs. And so now I'm kind of looking at it as, okay, I think whatever happens with the playoffs that's going to influence a lot of decisions. And, you know, I've tried to find an answer and I've reached out to some FCS administrators or conference administrators, officials, I should say. And I've kind of asked, you know, because the FCS playoffs are obviously an NCAA, you know, administered, sponsored, you know, playoff system. And so I said, are the FCS conferences that are still, you know, planning on playing, are they waiting for the NCAA to come in and say, all right, you know, things are trending decently in the right direction in this country, and so we still plan to, you know, hopefully have a playoff this fall. And then, you know, the remaining conferences and teams say, all right, you know, we're going to pursue a fall season because there's the playoffs, or maybe the NCAA comes out and says, you know, we're not seeing, you know, medically, we're not seeing the right things in this country right now. We're trending in the wrong direction, so we're going to push the playoffs to the spring. That would obviously influence, you know, the Montanas and the North Dakota States of the world to play in the spring. And so I was kind of asking, are the conferences waiting for the NCAA, or is the NCAA waiting for the conferences and the teams? Where, let's say there's 50 teams in the FCS that say, hey, we're in a region where we can play. We can go through all the protocols and the testing, and we're capable of doing all that. And there's 50 teams in the FCS that can do that this fall. The NCAA sees that and says, all right, that's enough teams. We're going to have the playoffs. And I'm trying to find out, you know, which one is it, you know, which one's coming first. And, you know, I don't even think the conferences have an answer for that. You know, it was described to me as kind of, you know, what came first, the chicken or the egg? This is kind of the same situation. Is they don't really know what exactly is going to happen. And I think maybe there is a chance where the NCAA is just going to look at it specifically, you know, at the FCS and say, hey, like we don't think we'll be able to sponsor a playoffs in the fall. But at the same time, there's no guarantees we can do the same in the spring just because of all the crossover. So we're going to leave it up to teams and the conferences to decide when they want to play. You know, there's not going to be a playoffs in the spring. There's not going to be a playoffs in the fall. If you want to pursue a fall schedule, you can. If you want to play in the spring, you can do that. But there's not going to be a playoffs. I think that potentially is a possibility. I just know that the conferences need 100% assurance from the NCAA, where if the NCAA says, you know, we're going to play the playoffs in the spring, these conferences need, okay, how are we going to do that? You know, there's going to be a ton of overlap. You know, we need 100% assurance that you're going to figure out a way to make sure the playoffs do happen in the spring, or else, you know, we're going to, you know, pursue games in the fall. So I don't know. It's a huge mess. The problem with having half the teams playing in the fall and half the teams playing in the spring is how does that impact 2021? I mean, those teams that play in the spring, they're going to be saying, all right, we can't start 2021 on September 1st. We're going to have to push things back to October 1st. But then if you have 50 teams that are playing this fall, they're going to be saying, no, we want to start the season on time next fall. So there's not a lot of – it doesn't seem like a lot of people are on the same page in the FCS, which makes it very difficult. And there's not one person that will technically decide this when it comes to the FCS. So that's, somewhat good news is it seems August 1st, that time range is when we're going to know for sure. But I tell people all the time that I have no idea what's going to happen. Brian and I, we talked to a lot of people to try to get a feel for it. But I don't even think the conference officials truly know what's going to happen. So we have no inside scoops because our insiders, they don't have scoops themselves.
Which makes the Big Sky Media Days on Thursdays super interesting.
Yeah, right. And we'll see. I doubt they're going to announce anything then.
No, but they moved them forward. That's what's so interesting. Like with all this, like we're waiting to see what happens, and they decide like instead of waiting to see what happens, we'll move forward. And everything appears that it's not just an announcement they're canceling the season because they still have players and everything lined up. So I just thought it was an interesting move that with all this uncertainty, they decided to go sooner. But
I don't think they're going to announce a cancellation. No. During the media days, that would seem like it would be in poor taste to be like, "Hey, here's our preseason poll, and here's the preseason conference teams. By the way, we're canceling."
All you coaches, thanks for taking time out of your day,
exactly.
But
and I know
you can go now.
And I know all the coaches' interviews and the player interviews was all pre-recorded. And Craig Haley and I joined. We recorded
day 2, right?
There's 2 days of it, I believe. Yeah. But Craig and I re-recorded something as well with the Big Sky. They're when they released their all conference teams, we kind of came in via video and talked about each player, and that's all pre-recorded. And the reason given to us why it's moving up is because all the recordings are done and all the publishing and the editing is all that is done, and they want to push it forward a week instead of having it the first weekend of August, because that's kind of when decisions are going to be made. So they basically said, we're ready to push this out a week before, so let's just do it.
Yeah. I got one real narrow scenario I want to run by you. Sam, let's say you are made the dean of FCS football. It's an imaginary position, but it becomes real.
Mac Brown brought that up last week. He said what he thinks we need is a commissioner of just college football at the NCAA. Because with all the conferences, there's too much like communication and people disagree and agree. He said if the NCAA came in and made someone like Sam dean or commissioner of college football, and he's also said, somebody else for basketball, volleyball, etc., but some central person. So, I like where this question's going because I was going to bring this up.
We'll go with commissioner. Dean's a little bit too pedantic. So, Commissioner Herder. Let's say our playoff scenario is either for fall or spring. We have a season that's cohesive enough, but there's not enough time to do the regular playoffs. There's only time for quarter, semis, finals. So a top 8. Commissioner Herder, how do you fill that top 8? Because obviously we can't just do. Are you going to say we still want to have auto bids? Because you look at your top 25. I don't know how a third place in the Missouri Valley, Northern Iowa could even make that playoffs with auto bids. But is a third place in the Missouri Valley team probably better than first in one of the smaller conferences? They likely are. So. I guess, Commissioner, you got 8 teams you can fill for the playoffs. What's your criteria? How are you going to do this with these, conference-only type schedules, shortened season, and all that?
Yeah, so that would be interesting. And by the way, speaking of the commissioners, I think it would make sense to have, a Power 5 commissioner, a Group of 5 commissioner, and an FCS commissioner. 3 different commissioners, because I don't know if you can have a commissioner that handles both the FCS and the Power 5, just because it is 2 way different worlds. But anyways, getting back on topic, it is interesting that, there is 10 auto bids into the conference or into the playoffs. 2 of those are already gone for the fall, and that's the Patriot League in the CAA. So numbers there would suggest, just take the 8 auto bids and put it into this playoff system. But I would disagree with that. It would probably, it would be fair for every single of the 8 remaining conferences to have a team compete for a national championship. But if you want to make this as realistic of a playoff as possible, you have to go off of, the 8 best teams. And I mean, no offense to San Diego, the Pioneer Football League, who's probably going to be the out bid this year. I have a ton of respect for that program and what they do as a non-scholarship. They've beaten Big Sky teams in the playoffs, but they're not a top 8 team in the FCS. And if you ask them that off the record, they know like they're not a top 8 team, but their goal is just to make it to the second round every year in the playoffs. So I don't think you can do auto bids. I think you just have to do, basically the same thing that the playoff committee does. They find their 8 seeds, and those are the 8 teams in the playoffs in this scenario. Because I don't think you could have, I don't think you can have the NEC auto bid and the Pioneer Football League auto bid in the playoffs ahead of Montana and South Dakota State. I don't think that would be that wouldn't be a true national tournament format.
Yeah. All right, we're gonna do Getting Iced here in a second. That's where we've been asking you kind of questions throughout this podcast. Gives you a question to ask us anything you'd like. It can be sports related, or it doesn't have to be sports related. So we'll give you a second to think about that. We'll do an ad read, and then it's all on you to ice us. Have your summer plans been canceled? Are you having a hard time finding a backup plan? Well, don't fret and don't look too far. There are amazing options right out your back door that offer the ultimate mix of fun, adventure, with an opportunity for social distancing. Venture into the largest protected wilderness in the continental United States for the ultimate form of social distancing. Hughes River Expeditions has first-class trips on rivers in the West since 1976. Enjoy a multi-day trip down the Middle Fork of the Salmon River Canyons, the Selway, or even a special trip like the one they're doing this year to see the Perside meteor shower. Camp on pristine beaches, hike amazing trails, spot wildlife, soak in beautiful natural hot springs. Take in the history all along the river, fish some of the most remote stretches of the river in the lower 48, and let Hughes River Expeditions handle everything else. Hughes River Expeditions has been vandal-owned and operated since 1976 and is ready to take you on the vacation of a lifetime. HRE is booking trips now through 2023. Don't miss out on a world-class trip right here in the Gem State. You can check them out on hughesriver.com or give them a call at the HRE office. What are you waiting for? Find out what it's like to grab a paddle, catch dinner, and ride the bull down world-class rivers right here in the Gem State. Call them now at 800-262-1882. That's 800-262-1882. There has never been a better time to get out in the fresh air of Idaho's backcountry. All right, Sam, Getting Iced. Hit us with your best shot.
Yeah, so I'll preface this with saying, you might know where I'm going to go with this, but I'll preface this with saying that I've never been a huge video game guy. But I've seen some running jokes, especially now that people are talking about
popular as ever.
NCAA football needs to come back, the video game. But I've seen some running jokes with NCAA football, the video game, in the Kibby Dome. I've seen like the Reddit College Football account tweet about it a lot. So what is the story behind that? Is just kind of like a running joke of people like playing in that stadium on the game, or what's the story behind that?
Yeah, as a big NCAA football guy, it is one of those teams that it's always been kind of a popular choice for people because, one, our story, I don't know why I'm saying Idaho's story is so unique in the terms of the WAC folded and we had to go independent. So then you had this team where you got to make all 12 games. So in that, if you've never played it, you get to make your whole schedule, except your conference schedule is based on real life. So you had this team back in the 2013, so last year they made it, where you have one of the bottom 5 teams in the FBS that you could schedule: Notre Dame, USC, Alabama, Tennessee, all these top teams, take them to a national title game. That and the Kibby Dome being so unique. And in the FCS, we talked about how there are a ton of domes in the FCS, but in the FBS, it's like us and Syracuse and UTSA basically. So it is a little bit more unique. The Carrier Dome's more well-known for basketball. UTSA is literally an old, basketball stadium that was converted and held a bowl game forever, so it's not really a college stadium. So I think it just held a unique place in people's hearts, and I think because they are that team that's in the game that isn't actually playing FBS football anymore, it is popular. But I do agree with you that we're more popular than ever now because people keep bringing up the Gibby Dome in NCAA 14, and somebody brought it up as an option to have every single team in the country come play in Moscow Pullman and just play all the games in the dome in a bubble. So I'm happy for the publicity. But it did kind of come out of nowhere. I'm not going to lie. I did not see it coming. As somebody who spent years online trying to make Idaho popular on that game, I'm surprised. I'm happy it finally happened.
Yeah, because I've seen it mentioned like 4 different times in the last 2 months. So I'm like, all right,
different accounts. It's crazy.
Yeah, the backstory of this, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners probably already know the backstory. But I was just curious of the reasoning for that.
Yeah, it's totally out of left field. I believe it's Thor on Reddit who are on College Football Reddit that kind of started the whole thing, and then I think some other pieces took it from there. Like, oh, that is a cool idea, and now if you never took Idaho to the national championship in NCAA 14, did you ever play NCAA 14? So, I'm stoked it happened. It's one thing I guess we'll have on Boise State. But Brian, do you have anything to add?
I am really glad you had the expertise to handle that question because I think I'm probably more in Sam's world where I just don't really play video games. I don't hold against people who play video games, but it's just not something I just don't have the ability to do that with my time. But mercifully, Chris, you were able to save us because I was going to have to take us in the bailout direction of, White Claw sponsoring the Dome or something like that, just to change topic.
That's Montucky.
Well, Montucky first.
Yeah. Anyways, all right. Well, everyone, that was Sam. Sam, if they don't know how to find you, let them know how to find you and what's going on in your life.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is right there at Sam Herder FCS, and all of our content, written content, is on herosports.com, and then also we have a podcast called B Mac and Herd's FCS podcast, where you can find that basically anywhere podcasts are available. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, we want to thank you for coming on. This was a year where we needed the extra expertise. So glad you came on. I'm sure by the time this airs Thursday on actual podcast network or, podcast streaming software, everything will be different again. But as of Tuesday when we recorded this, and for those that tuned in on YouTube, it was good having you on, and thank you so much for all the information.
Absolutely. Thank you guys once again for having me.
Yep. All right. See you, Sam.
All right. See you guys. Bye.
All right, Brian. So, any takeaways from Sam? And then let's try to do Cup of Joe conversation recap to you and our listeners who didn't catch it as fast as possible. And then let's get out of here. We're in mid-season form. We could actually do a decently timed podcast today.
Now, I like that. It was interesting to hear Sam go over, particularly the Northern Iowa. Not that we're the Northern Iowa podcast now, but I did
bring them up as a possible opponent, so maybe we are.
Yeah, he's just in. He's in a different world covering the entire FCS, so he gets to learn more about that. I know, let's say we had Grizz fan on here, their reaction would have been, okay, we're not talking about last year, man. We're talking about the last 5 decades. But they're also in a real tough conference. That was why I was curious about the playoff situation.
Yeah, that's a good
because the Missouri Valley would be like the Big Sky, even if it's only the core like non-California schools who can play. If that means Montana State, Weber, and Eastern are all playing each other, there's some math. Some teams have to lose some games there. If you only lose to a couple top 10 teams, should an auto bid from a weak conference get a playoff spot? Typically, I'm pretty egalitarian, but this time, no. I just say you have to say, man, dude, the season's just kind of weird and it sucks. Yeah. But
you take the coach's poll too. Don't even. Probably whose poll do you take at that point? Because that's the problem too. We don't have an official media poll. I know technically it's Stats, which is Craig Haley's website, but probably stats. I mean, honestly, I would trust Brian and Sam probably the most, but I just don't think with it only being two people, they would ever agree to allowing two people to really have a decision on who the best 8 teams are. But that's the other problem without having the established media poll and us knowing that coaches' polls are just a bunch of hogwash. It's curious, man. It's curious.
Just heavily weight the Hero Sports poll, wrap it into the stats poll. Pretend Brian and D-Mac are like, just pretend they're like 10 voters.
Their poll is triple the points for each team they rank.
Yeah, exactly, and completely bail on the coaches poll, which if you guys are new to FCS, the FCS coaches poll is the absolute worst top 25 in like the history of top 25s.
Yeah, 100% agree. All right, so you missed Cup of Joe, so I'm just going to give you a quick recap and everybody else that's on, and then you have any questions from what you might have missed, I'll try to answer them. If possible, she didn't answer them. It was more of Terry, Director Gawlik, talking kind of they softballed her in some questions to begin with, which rightfully so. It's supposed to be – this is directed at the university as a whole, not just athletics fans. So some people just need to get to know who she is. How she came to Idaho, how she's liking it, how she got into sports, that kind of whole route. The stuff that we would care about and the people that are on here would care about. 72 players have shown up for voluntary workouts. Now whether this stuff we've covered, so sorry if I'm repeating myself. The Kibbie Dome has very strict procedures in place right now with who can work out in groups. It's all voluntary. They don't start until I think she said August 1st with actual practice. As far as kind of Sam brought it up, the deadline being August 1st, and some people said July 1st. July 31st. She also said there was a deadline July 1st, and they pushed it back. So she doesn't expect any of these dates to really mean anything more than like a really solid check-in. But yeah, the Idaho, she feels really strong about we're ahead of the curve in terms of how we're handling COVID, how we're handling testing, not only as an athletic department, but as a school. Temperature is checked every time you enter the Kibbie Dome. You're closely monitored. And she brought up that they're college kids. And unfortunately, we've seen it with some other schools where they weren't necessarily doing their parts. But Idaho, they're in a bubble, and there's only so much you can do to control kids in a bubble. But they're doing their best, and that includes all sports. And as of now, they're very loose. She's under the impression that right now they're full bore on fall. Kind of, if you watch college football live, they had Sankey on, the SEC commissioner, very same thing, with the ability to quickly pivot to spring. She also brought up, we talked about it, that the FCS is actually better set in her mind than the FBS to move to the spring, because the FCS playoffs, as we like to brag about, are the only NCAA crown national championship, meaning the NCAA can move it, no contracts, no nothing. The national championship game isn't sponsored. It isn't the Reese's Pieces, Frisco Bowl. It is just the NCAA FCS championship. So there's no tie-in. So moving it to spring isn't an issue. Where she brought up March Madness is. The Final Four is sponsored. The March Madness is sponsored. FBS, those bowl games, and she brought up, that's why you aren't seeing necessarily, by the FCS you're seeing teams fold, and in the FBS you're not, is probably a lot of it is contractual to some of these bowl games, where if you're the AAC and you can't field the whole team, like that's money you're missing out on, where we don't have the benefit of making any extra money other than hosting a game for the playoffs, So the FCS is almost better set because we're not leaving money on the table. We're not really subject to some of these contracts that, like the Idaho famous Potato Bowl, is sponsored by the Idaho Potato Commission. So that money goes to teams. And if they can't field Mountain West and the MAC or whoever it is now can't field teams, that's a problem for the NCAA and ESPN and everybody involved. And so that's where she said the FBS, that's why you're probably seeing more teams or more schools not even be more steadfast on we're playing in the fall, where she actually did throw around that in the FCS, it might actually it's becoming more and more of a possibility. God, I'm trying to think if I missed anything else. The ICCU arena is coming along great. We're very happy with it. She brought up next project. When this one's done, what she would like to see done is improving the outdoor practice facility. She didn't really elaborate on what that means, just that right now soccer and football share it. which isn't necessarily fair because if somebody's working on something, somebody might have to go in the Kibby Dome, and sometimes the Kibby Dome isn't set up for practice. And so I don't know if that means, I'm imagining maybe that's why they left that little strip that we were talking about in the last episode, is adding maybe another little 50-yard cutout right there. But her next facility thing she would like to look at would be improving and maybe adding to the outdoor practice facility. So that was cool. She brought up that her ideal first concert in the ICCU would be George Strait, but that she also brought up that she does not think we could afford that price tag, but dreamers can dream, basically. And she's from Texas. He's from Texas. Maybe she could place a call. I'm trying to think if I missed anything else. Feel free to ask me, but it was good. It only went 40 minutes. It was supposed to be an hour. I was kind of like, oh, that's it for questions. We got to let her go now. I'm like, we started 5 minutes late and it's ending 15 minutes early. So it was a 40-minute conversation. There's 20 more minutes worth of stuff I could personally ask, but maybe that's why we'll have to have her on. I will say, love her. Like, I've gotten the chance to listen to her twice now in the last 3 weeks. I was already a pretty good fan. I'm like all in on TG. She is. I think we're going good places between her and Scott Green. I think we finally figured it out. But
yeah, we've talked a little bit off camera about some of the things that have taken place, and
some of those were not disclosed. Which there's some pipelines coming or some big news coming down the pipeline that I think people will be really excited about.
Which, if I could share that, I'd love to. But we will not err on the side of.
And it's not confirmed. We don't want to get egg on our face.
Yeah, I was going to say vacating our legal defense fund, but I got to say two things. One, I hope TG gets to a point where she is more comfortable being open about some of the work that they're doing, or maybe open's the wrong term, but being more, let's say, aggressive like Lynn Hickey has been in getting on more public channels, because
all of Eastern.
Yeah, because I got to say, I think that we hired a technocrat in a positive sense, meaning Terry Gawlik is interested in our athletic department functioning well, not in like the sexy headline of firing a coach. Whether the coach should be fired or not, I mean, it's a thing you can point to all people and say like, hey, I did something big. If you hire a new coach, whereas doing the work of structuring going through the risk management for structuring a season, doing the work of trying to increase things like, compliance within the athletic department itself, the stuff that we need for the athletic department to be as functional as it can possibly be is the stuff she's been working on, to my understanding. But that's the kind of stuff that also just doesn't show up in a headline. So I got to say, if you're a person who's curious, like, hey, when are we going to hear about some of the big things? I mean, again, Idaho's a regional leader in setting protocols for what the season's going to be. And it was also a risk for Idaho to say, as early as we did. I mean, look, Eastern and Portland State have said nothing. Montana and Montana State are going to wait until the last minute because, I mean, in their defense, they have attendance.
She did touch on Portland State. The city of Portland, the county it's in, which I believe is Clackamas, don't quote me on that, but they're still in phase one. So she brought up their athletes are not even allowed to be in a facility right now. So Portland State, that is something I was not aware of yet. It's funny, on the piece I brought up that I wrote today, I almost brought that up for, was it California? No, it was Portland State. I brought up how Portland State, when I mentioned, that's why I originally, for those who haven't read it, I brought up them as an option. It's both home and away in week 3, whatever they would prefer. And I brought up originally, I was like, based on their local policies happening, they might not even be able to play home games in week 3. So it might be better for them if they need to play at all, just to come to Idaho, even though they'd have a bye week and then be back at Idaho basically in 3 weeks or 2 weeks. But I decided to leave it out because I was like, season's changing. I don't want this piece to be like about whose policies or what. But then that was something funny because I was like, and plus I don't know for sure what their policies are. And I didn't really want to look it up for kind of a fun. It was meant to be a fun piece. And then I find out on this call this afternoon that they don't even have, like, their kids are not in facilities, period. Which then goes to California schools, Portland State. You live basically on the Washington border. I live in Washington. Eastern Washington's starting to get, I mean, Governor Inslee over here, like the Big 12 or the Big Sky schedule this year could literally be Montana, Montana State, Idaho, Idaho State, Weber, NAU. But yeah, it could be. It's going to be weird, and that's why in one of my comments on the piece, I just told somebody's like, "Well, that's just silly playing Montana twice," and I was like, I hate to break to people, it's a silly year. You got to come up with silly ideas if you want 11 games. And then I brought up maybe 11. We don't want 11 games. Maybe 9 is fine. Maybe just playing 8 in conference is good. But so that is interesting. She brought that up. Portland State may be out because if you're still in phase 1 and I'm living in Washington in phase 2, and I know I'm worried about Eastern, like if you're still in phase 1 and training camp's supposed to start in 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. Yikes.
Eastern can't have groups larger than 5 right now based off Spokane County. So, I mean, so I guess I probably shouldn't have thrown Eastern under the bus there. But the whole point being, our Idaho announced first, and they took risk by announcing first. And I'm just going to presume for a second that they had the right kind of guidance to say that what they said was feasible. They did the kind of things that some people are upset about in this region. They said, hey, you got to have masks. They said, did the rule about no reentry. So, if you're going to do a season, they had, 12 feet of space between people. So if you're going to have a season, we did we announced the things that you would need to have based off what, most available research says. And in this region, some of that stuff's not popular. I will certainly say that Terry Gawlik has much more bravery than the mayors where I live in terms of what she's announcing. So I got to say, from what I've heard so far, I'm pretty happy that we have her on board.
And I'd say, I mean, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here on this because, nobody knows us. And so I'm trying to keep all of our stuff out of this as much as possible. But if you're honestly telling me, no matter where you stand on the masks, no mask, vaccine, no vax, if you're a college football fan and the only thing you have to do is not leave at halftime and wear a mask, like, are you seriously telling me that you will not attend a college football game because of that? Like, that's fine. You do you. I'm not going to judge you for that. But I'm saying, like, for me, like, there was a joke about these people wearing, like, basically, like, tents, like, bubble boy. You could put me in a bubble and I will go to college football. Like, you could – whatever you want me to wear, I will wear it to be able to be in attendance safely at a college football game this year. So, the fact that it's just masks, no reentry, and I can't sit within 12 feet of a different party, like, that's fine. Like, I don't want to sit next to, smelly Tony and Sally who were eating chili all out in the tailgate the whole time anyways. I'd rather have 12 feet between me and them. So, like, doesn't change anything for me. People that thought you're going to be able to go to college football without a mask this year, it's shocking to me. And she brought up, though, that's one of the things. It's funny that you brought up they came out first because they said that people were giving them grief for being so silent for a while. And she brought up, we didn't want to seem panicked. We didn't want to seem misinformed. And she goes, some of the people on my staff were very like, we need to get this out. People are asking. And Terry said, like, no, I think it's more important that we put out the right information at the right time. And so they took a very strategic approach, made sure everything was right. They had it worded the way they wanted it to. And that's why they released it. And then it just goes to show what she was saying, that I do honestly feel which is weird for Idaho. I feel like we are more prepared and ahead of the curve than most teams in the country right now in terms of this, which we are so used to being behind the 8 ball on every single decision ever. It just goes to show that this pandemic might show that Terry is absolutely the right person. And we have some benefits to us, like Eastern. Lynn Hickey's a good AD, but she's got to deal with installing a new turf, raising money because they're in the middle of a financial, infighting. Terry just gets to focus on really this and some other issues, obviously. But I don't know. I'm very happy with the leadership. I think they've handled everything great to this point. I have faith they're going to do this in the safest way possible. And you know what? If we're being honest, I don't think we're going to get 5,100 people in a game anyways. So that attendance number is already higher than it needs to be. You could probably make it 3,000 between people that will feel safe in a game this year and people that are willing to buy tickets, especially to an abbreviated season that might have 4 games within 5 weeks in the Kippy Dome. I don't know. I'm happy. That's all I'm saying. Like, Terry, thank you. I like what the university's put out. I have faith in you guys, no matter how this season turns out right now. But yeah, I'm content. Sorry, I really filibustered there for a second.
No, dude, it's fine. Again, we've spent some time on this show talking about like coaches, let's say, coaches who shall remain nameless, that we've at times been frustrated with. And I just want to say with, we're trying to focus on turning the corner from last year. It's a breath of fresh air to be able to talk about the administration here and go over that. You know what? They did their homework. They put together a plan. They were, brave. They
flagship.
Yeah, exactly. They were cautious enough to make sure things seemed reasonable. So it's not like just announcing then we're going to cancel the next day.
She did bring up that they did it before and better than Boise State. So I also like that fire from her. Like, go TG.
Beat Idaho State too. Idaho State has said they have their protocols set and haven't announced, but Idaho was out and said it. So, we just got to keep our fingers crossed that, like we said on the show earlier, until there's no fall season, there's a fall season.
Yep.
So
and that's how we're treating this for people that are like, why are you previewing? In case you didn't notice, half your teams in the top 25 aren't even competing anymore. Which is why we're not covering them. But until we're told those other 25 teams we just talked about in place are not playing, we're going to cover it like we did. And guess what? If we do this all again in December, Brian and I are not going to be complaining. We get to talk and get excited about football twice. So exactly. and until it's done and dusted, we're going to act like it's not, because the last thing we want to do is say, no reason to preview for you guys. The season's not going to happen. And then, boom, week one, we're playing football. And we're like, oh, we did no covering of the team. So if anything, you just get to hear things twice and things will change. But that's basically it. Cup of Joe recap. One more thing before closing the bar, our new favorite segment, the transfer portal.
We actually have some news in the transfer portal. And I'm curious if your news is my news.
Possibly. I'll let you go first. I'll let you know if it's not my news.
So the activity in the transfer portal, Professor now, Chuck Staben, there's no news to my knowledge about him entering into the transfer portal, as in he has a presidency he's looking at, but he did get a little light on the Caves and Prater show, where he went on and talked about how what he actually thinks some schools may do is something Idaho did towards the end of his time, which is you add a few non-scholarship programs, because that increases athletic department revenue and university revenue through increased tuition from students who wouldn't be going there otherwise. We've seen some schools have cut programs, like Southern Utah cut men's and women's tennis. A ton of schools have cut men's and women's tennis because that is the Title IX thing, plus it's a non-revenue sport. But our man Chuck Staben got to go over something that we very well may see, in the next few years, of instead of cutting programs, because that does ultimately hurt the bottom lines of university in terms of tuition dollars lost, having a few non-scholarship programs, maybe something like in Idaho. Obviously there's Title IX stuff, but he didn't say this, but like lacrosse could be a non-scholarship sport. And that would be, I think, positive for our school. It'd be positive for a lot of schools in this region.
Yeah, speaking of the only school out west that does it is Denver, and they're always in the final. I mean, they're doing scholarships, but yeah, as a former lacrosse person, I've been saying that forever, that when I'm a bajillionaire, me and another one of my buddies literally said our donation to the athletics was going to be sponsoring scholarships for lacrosse. But I'm far away from that, and as we're cutting sports, that is probably a sport that you're not likely to see scholarships unless it becomes a major sport here in the – it's going to basically be the sports with professional leagues are going to sponsor sports, and then whatever else you got to do for Title IX is going to fill in. So, like, maybe women's swimming, golf, etc. But, like, if you have baseball, you're going to play baseball. If you have basketball, you're going to play basketball. Football, you're going to play football. But, yeah, if you have racquetball, you're probably going to drop racquetball. Most of the Olympic sports that don't have professional leagues, I expect to see being dropped here shortly. Terry Gawlik did also mention they are not planning on dropping sports. If anything, they're looking at ways to possibly add sports. So Those teams are off the chopping block for now.
And circling back to the transfer portal, because that's the interest point.
Yes.
Listeners, you got to be stoked that Chuck Staben's getting a second wind of publicity, because if he's able to, yeah, I mean, if he can get a couple, if he can get a couple articles or something like that written, maybe some schools that are, I don't know, lower tier, where athletics, they have like more the Ivy League profile. I don't mean in prestige, but it's in like the Ivy League is much less concerned about sports than, let's say University of Idaho is. He gets a couple glowing headlines like that, looking like a guy who has, priorities and is looking at budgets and all that. Maybe he actually does enter the transfer portal and we can have a celebratory send-off.
Yeah. And not to mention, out of that transfer portal, Jeff Caves has left the Treasure Valley and is now down in Dallas, Texas. So we did lose one just lover of Idaho football down there in the center of the universe. Just always a fan of ours, never said anything negative, never took crack shots at us. Just a real stand-up guy down there on the radio, shipped off to Boise, or out of Boise, good riddance. But yeah, Jeff Caves did enter the transfer portal and has left. So one less Bronco on the radio down there. Maybe I'm just thinking of a guy who might have been on the radio and TV up in Spokane who's might be a good ad. I'm just saying. Little Dennis Patchen down in Boise. I'd be all aboard the Dennis Patchen and Boise trade. Who's that other guy? He's on. It's Jeff Caves and Mike Prater, right? Yeah. Prater and Patchen. That's got a ring to it.
P squared.
Yeah. All right. Closing the bar. Thank you, everybody. Make sure you check out Sam Herder. We will be back in 2 weeks. That's on 8/6, so August 6th. For our Big Sky preview, we're going to have Taylor Barton on of, just about everything. Most of you probably know him for being one of the commentators for Root Sports for the Big Sky Game of the Week. He also does a ton of stuff in the Northwest for quarterbacks and high school football players, like the Quarterback Alliance. He used to do Northwest Index, I believe it was. He does 7-on-7 Passing Academy. He knows so much. How we meant to ask Sam about CJ McCollum. Oh, well, but a guy we can't ask will be Taylor Barton. So make sure you tune in. That'll be fun. The guy covers the Big Sky for Root Sports. So it'll be fun to talk to him, and we'll maybe get a little bit of insight on how Root Sports does things and maybe get him to drop if how they're going to do it for 2020. But we got that. The Big Sky Media Days moved up to Thursday, the 23rd and 24th. We'll be doing a watch along. So tune in 9 a.m. Mountain Time or Pacific Time, 10 a.m. Mountain Time on this YouTube channel right here. If you're watching us, we'll be hosting it, or head on over to FCS Fans Nation on Facebook. We'll also be live streaming it there. It's going to be Big Sky Podcast Network personalities popping in all throughout, kind of watching the Big Sky Commissioner's address and kind of all that stuff that goes on with a virtual kickoff. So we'll have people from Grizz Fan, R&R Catcast, NAU, Eagle, Power Hour. Some of the FCS Fans Nation guys have the invite. We'll see if they pop on. So it should be fun. You'll be able to interact with us and just pretty much turn on Pluto TV and watch us. Brian, I don't know. Were you planning on making either day one or day two? We haven't really talked about it.
I'm going to make part of it. I know that.
That's the goal. I'll be on the whole time, but everybody else is going to pop in when Montana's talking or Idaho or, whoever their teams are. So hopefully you guys will do the same. Then on the 27th, we have an Idaho preview pending. Come on, we can safely play a season by then. And then we don't have a week one opponent anymore, which is, I don't know. I just looked at that. That kind of throws off our week one preview. Maybe we just go bi-weekly until that point, because that will be weekly. We'll find it out. That's a long way away. That's the beginning of September. But Terry Gawlik did purposely say no comment, or what I believe her exact quote was, "We didn't talk about what I say when I'm not allowed to answer," on when she asked about, and then took a very snide, sip of her coffee. But on if they had been talking to anybody to replace week one and week three games and who. So it makes me sound like there's at least been phone calls being placed and maybe something close to being announced. But we'll see. We're not going to speculate. But either way, week one's up in the air. We're up in the air for week one. That's what we got. Make sure you follow us at Tubs at the Club on Twitter. You can find me at Chris_P_Hammond on Twitter. You can find Brian at Brian Marceau. That's MARCEAU. Got it. It's easy in my head compared to seeing it out. But that's it. We'll see you guys possibly on Thursday and Friday. If not, we'll see you in 2 weeks for our Big Sky preview. Oh, it's time for the best band in all the land, Sound of Idaho. Play us out. Go Vandals.
Go Vandals.